In the shadow of war, a wounded soldier and a broken stray dog cross paths on a rain-soaked night. Both carry scars, visible and invisible, that refuse to heal. When the dog limps into the soldier's life, he's reluctant to let him in, but the animal's quiet loyalty begins to chip away at the walls around his heart. Together they embark on a journey of healing, proving that even the deepest wounds can mend with time, trust, and the unlikeliest of friendships. But can they find the courage to leave the past behind and embrace a new beginning? The rain fell in sheets, a relentless downpour that turned the cobblestone streets of the small village into a shimmering mirror. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and wood smoke, and the occasional rumble of thunder echoed like distant artillery. It was the kind of rain that made people hurry indoors, seeking the warmth of hearth and home. But for one soul, there was no home to return to. A scruffy, mud-streaked dog limped through the alleyways, his ribs visible beneath his matted fur. One of his hind legs dragged slightly, a fresh wound oozing blood where a piece of shrapnel had grazed him. He didn't know how long he'd been wandering. Days, maybe weeks. The world was a blur of hunger, pain, and the faint memory of a kind hand that had once fed him scraps. That hand was gone now, lost in the chaos of war. The dog paused beneath, the flickering light of a street lamp, his golden eyes scanning the empty street. He was tired, so tired, but something compelled him to keep moving, as if an invisible thread were pulling him forward. At the edge of the village, where the cobblestone gave way to a dirt path leading into the woods, stood a small cottage. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the faint glow of a lantern spilled from its windows. The dog hesitated, his instincts warring between fear and hope. He had learned to be wary of humans, but the warmth of that light called to him like a siren's song. Inside the cottage, Captain Elias Grayson sat by the fire, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, the once proud insignia now dull and tarnished. The war was over, but the battles still raged in his mind. He could still hear the screams of his men, the deafening roar of artillery, the silence that followed. Elias stared into the flames, his hand trembling as he reached for the bottle. He had come home, but home didn't feel like home anymore. The walls of the cottage seemed to close in on him, and the silence was suffocating. He missed the camaraderie of his unit, the sense of purpose that had driven him forward. Now, there was only emptiness. A faint scratching at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He frowned, setting the bottle down. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Elias stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and crossed the room to the door. When he opened it, he found himself staring into the golden eyes of the stray dog. The animal looked up at him, his tail giving a tentative wag, despite the pain etched in every line of his body. For a moment, man and dog simply regarded each other, two wounded souls standing in the rain. Elias sighed. "Go on now," he said, his voice rough. "I've got nothing for you." But the dog didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes pleading, as if to say, "Neither do I." Something in those eyes stirred a memory in Elias, a memory of a young boy who had once brought home a stray kitten despite his father's protests. The boy had named the kitten Lucky, and for a while it had brought a spark of joy to their dreary home. Elias hesitated, then stepped aside. "All right," he muttered. "Come in then, but don't expect much." The dog limped inside, leaving a trail of muddy paw prints on the floor. Elias closed the door behind him, shutting out the rain and the cold. The dog settled by the fire, his body trembling as the warmth seeped into his bones. Elias watched him for a moment, then fetched an old blanket and draped it over the animal. He didn't know why he was doing this. He barely had the energy to take care of himself, let alone a wounded stray. But there was something about the dog's quiet resilience that struck a chord in him. Over the next few days, Elias tended to the dog's wounds as best he could. He cleaned the shrapnel graze with whiskey, earning a yelp of protest, and wrapped it in a clean bandage. He shared what little food he had, though the dog seemed content with scraps. The dog, for his part, seemed to sense Elias's pain. He would sit quietly by the soldier's side, his head resting on Elias's knee, as if to offer comfort. At night, when Elias's nightmares woke him in a cold sweat, the dog would nuzzle his hand, grounding him in the present. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Elias found himself talking to the dog. He told him about the war, about the friends he had lost, about the guilt that gnawed at him like a festering wound. The dog listened, his golden eyes never leaving Elias's face. "I don't know why I'm telling you all this," Elias said with a bitter laugh. "You probably don't understand a word I'm saying." But the dog tilted his head, as if to say, "I understand more than you think." As the days turned into weeks, a fragile bond began to form between the two. The dog, whom Elias had started calling Scout, became a constant presence in his life. He followed Elias everywhere, his limp gradually fading as his wound healed. For the first time in months, Elias felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a small thing, barely noticeable, but it was there, a spark of hope. Spring arrived in full bloom, painting the village in vibrant hues of green and gold. The once barren trees now swayed with fresh leaves, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers. For Elias, the changing season brought a subtle shift in his mood. The heavy fog of despair that had clung to him for so long began to lift, if only slightly, and he found himself venturing outside more often. Scout, now fully healed, was his constant companion. The dog's limp had disappeared, and his coat, though still scruffy, had taken on a healthy sheen. He trotted beside Elias with an air of purpose, his tail wagging as if to say, "This is where I belong." One morning, Elias decided to take Scout on a longer walk than usual. They followed a narrow trail that wound through the woods, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves, a stark contrast to the silence that had once felt suffocating to Elias. As they walked, Scout darted ahead, his nose to the ground as he sniffed out every new scent. Elias watched him with a faint smile, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in years. It was strange, he thought, how such a small creature could bring so much light into his life. They reached a clearing where a small stream trickled over smooth stones. Scout bound ahead, splashing into the water with a joyful bark. Elias laughed, a genuine, unrestrained sound that surprised even himself. He knelt by the stream, dipping his hands into the cool water and splashing it onto his face. Scout trotted over, shaking himself off and spraying water everywhere. Elias chuckled, ruffling the dog's wet fur. "You're a mess, you know that?" The dog responded by licking his face, his tail wagging furiously. For a moment, Elias forgot about the war, the guilt, the nightmares. All that mattered was the here and now, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the sound of the stream, the companionship of a loyal friend. But healing, was not a linear process. That night, as Elias lay in bed, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. He was back on the battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the screams of his men. He tried to run to help them, but his legs wouldn't move. He was paralyzed, helpless, as the world around him crumbled. He woke with a start, his heart pounding and his sheets drenched in sweat. For a moment, he couldn't breathe, the weight of his guilt pressing down on his chest. Then he felt a warm presence beside him. Scout had jumped onto the bed, his body pressed against Elias's side. The dog nuzzled his hand, his breath steady and reassuring. Elias buried his face in Scout's fur, his breathing slowly returning to normal. "I don't know if I can do this," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know if I can..." "Keep going." Scout licked his hand, his golden eyes filled with unwavering loyalty. "You're not alone," they seemed to say, and for the first time, Elias believed it. As the weeks turned into months, Elias found himself changing in ways he hadn't thought possible. The weight of his guilt, while still present, no longer consumed him. He began to take small steps toward rebuilding his life, one day at a time. He started by fixing up the cottage. The roof, which had leaked during the last rainstorm, was patched with new shingles. The overgrown garden was cleared, and Elias planted a few vegetables, something he hadn't done since he was a boy. Scout watched him work, often digging holes or chasing after birds, but always returning to Elias's side. The villagers, who had once regarded Elias with a mixture of pity and wariness, began to warm up to him. They noticed the change in him, the way he smiled more often, the way he greeted them with a nod or a kind word. One day, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove approached him as he was repairing a fence near the edge of the village. "You've done a fine job with that fence," she said, her voice warm. "I don't suppose you'd be willing to help me with my porch. It's been creaking something awful." Elias hesitated, then nodded. "I'll take a look at it." Mrs. Hargrove's porch was indeed in need of repair, and Elias spent the better part of the afternoon fixing it. As he worked, she brought him tea and biscuits, and they talked about the village, the weather, and the upcoming spring festival. "You should come," she said as he packed up his tools. "It's a lovely time. There's music, dancing, and plenty of good food." Elias smiled faintly. "I'll think about it." That evening, as he sat on the porch with Scout, he found himself considering her invitation. The thought of being around so many people still made him uneasy, but he couldn't deny that he was lonely. The day of the festival arrived, and the village square was alive with color and sound. Streamers hung from the trees, and the air was filled with the scent of roasted meat and fresh bread. Elias stood at the edge of the square, Scout by his side, feeling out of place. But then Mrs. Hargrove spotted him and waved him over. "Come on now," she said, her voice firm but kind. "You're not going to stand there all day." Elias allowed himself to be pulled into the festivities. He ate, he listened to the music, and he even danced a little, though he felt self-conscious. Scout stayed close, his tail wagging as if to encourage him. As the sun set and the lanterns were lit, Elias found himself sitting on a bench, watching the villagers laugh and dance. For the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of belonging. Scout rested his head on Elias's knee, his eyes filled with contentment. Elias scratched behind the dog's ears, a smile tugging at his lips. "You know," he said softly, "I think you saved me as much as I saved you." Scout wagged his tail, his eyes shining with love. And in that moment, Elias realized that home wasn't a place, it was a feeling. It was the warmth of a fire on a cold night, the sound of a loyal friend's breathing, the knowledge that no matter how dark the world seemed, there was always a light to guide you home. Together, the stray and the soldier had found their way.